effectively what's happening is we're being taxed twice. I'm not saying that we should have a free education, but with the tripling of fees, okay, that's obviously paying for our contribution. In addition to that, as a graduate, we are going to be higher earners over our lifetime. Effectively, we are still contributing and paying tax. Or are you suggesting that it should be a different option, which is more the sort of like graduate tax option, rather than just the majority of the tuition fee being passed on to students?
Well, in a way, a graduate tax, just without wishing to get completely diverted, a graduate tax says you've got a 1 or 2p on your income tax, but I think there's some pretty big problems with that. Some courses are 4 years and some are 2 years. Do you have the same, but both are graduate? Do you have the same fees? Some are scientific, some are humanities. Some are...
An example is I graduated in 2010 with tuition fee and maintenance grants and loans of £24,500.
Yeah.
A student who's going to start in September of this year will be graduating with sort of like debts of just over sort of like £40,000 to £50,000, and I haven't even added the interest on. On top of that, I'm still paying tax on my earnings.
And?
I'm saying it's like effectively what is students who are starting in September 12 are sort of like paying sort of like twice. And
well, I think it's a very, the reason I'm worried it's such a big risk, although it's interesting, I was told by the Vice-Chancellor here that you've had a 5% increase in applications for next September, which is kind of interesting. I mean, I think that's because in the end, higher education is a very good investment. But I agree with you, it's a hell of a lot of money, 40 or 50 grand. Hell of a lot of money. And the, I mean, it'll put pressure on the institutions, by the way, in terms of quality and, you know, outputs, which is not a bad thing. But I think that it's the size, the scale of the leap that I think makes it a leap in the dark. And I don't think, what your original question was, are you paying twice? I don't think you're really paying twice, but you're contributing your taxes towards the health service and everything else. If you earn more than 21,000, you end up making a contribution toward 9% towards your, to pay off your tuition fees. My wife went to a university in America. She ended up paying them off over a long period, 20 years. She's a music student, so it was various complications associated with it. But I think that you've got to keep the progressivity of the repayment schedule. Otherwise, you end up in very, very big problems.
Thanks very much. Yeah, right at the back, about 3 rows in. Gentleman, you know, sort of fawny top with a university logo on, I think.
Do you think it is about time that the British public had a referendum on European membership, bearing in mind that nearly every other country in Europe has had that privilege apart from Britain, whose last referendum was the 5th of June 1975?
I didn't hear the bit about bearing in mind.
Bearing in mind that every other country in Europe has had the privilege apart from Britain, whose last referendum was the 5th of June 1975.
Just explain what you mean by every other country having the privilege. I didn't understand that.
Well, every other country in Europe has had the privilege of a referendum.
I'm not sure that's right, actually. Germany's not had referendums, and I mean, there's quite a few. Italy.
Two.
Sorry?
Ireland has had
Ireland's had 2, but that's because the Irish constitution says that any time there's any change in their constitution, they have to have a referendum. But Italy, Germany, Luxembourg, Austria, they've not had referendums. Anyway, let me take seriously your question in and of itself, because I think it's a good and legitimate question. I think that you should have referendums when there is a fundamental change in your relationship between your own country and the European Union. If we were ever to want to join the Economic and Monetary Union, that would be a fundamental change in our governance, because we'd no longer be setting our own interest rates. That should certainly have a referendum. But I think that short of that, I don't see that a referendum is the answer, really. We're a parliamentary democracy, and if we change our constitution, then we should have referendums. So Scottish devolution has a referendum associated with it. Scottish independence would have a referendum associated with it. In respect of the European Union, I think that, I mean, the first thing I say is that a lot of talk about Europe often confuses the European Court of Human Rights, which is in the news today. Of course, that's nothing to do with the European Union. That's an independent thing. The Council of Europe was actually set up by Winston Churchill in the late 1940s. So I don't really buy that. So I think there is a case for referendums when there's a fundamental shift in the balance of power, but I don't think there's been a fundamental shift in the balance of power. There's a European club which we're members of. If people say they don't want to be members of it, then obviously you could have a referendum to withdraw from it, but I don't really want us to withdraw from it. What I think we should be is in there trying to shape it to our advantage.
Britain decide themselves, should have the opportunity to decide whether they want to be in Europe or not.
You're saying we should revisit the 1975 referendum because of the passage of time?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can see the argument, but I think that I'm not persuaded. I prefer my argument, which says we're a parliamentary democracy, and if there's a fundamental shift in the balance of power, then yes, you need a referendum. But short of that, I don't see the case for it.
Okay, thanks. Aidan Byrne.
Is there room for, and has there been enough self-doubt in your own politics, Labour's politics, and the political sphere in general?
Self-doubt?
Yeah.
I mean, do you mean self-criticism or self-doubt?
Both.
Yeah. I think that self-criticism is a public thing, and self-doubt is a private thing. In respect of self-criticism, I think that, as I said in answer to the second or third question, I've had to reflect a lot on my own politics. And I think one of the challenges for the Labour Party, and really a qualification for Labour to win the next election, is really, really, really understand why people voted against it in 2010. Until a party really respects the reasons that people voted against it in 2010 at the last election, it's not going to qualify for winning next time. Now, not everyone voted against us, and you know, you've got two great MPs in Wolverhampton, Pat McFadden and Emma Reynolds, who won. But I think that as a party, we've really got to understand why people perceived us as big statist, why people perceived us as out of touch, why people perceived us as overspending. And until we do that, you know, people are going to want to see that we've done that. That's self-criticism starts with understanding how you're seen. Self-doubt takes you into a rather different area. I mean, I think that you've always got to have the humility to know that you might be wrong, and you've always got to be open to sort of have the humility to see the way other people might see you. Equally, I think that you don't want to get buffeted just by what the media say about you. And that's, I think, where you've got to be careful that you don't just follow fashion. Because just because your view isn't popular doesn't mean it's wrong. And so on things like Europe, that's quite a tricky enterprise, I would say.